Welcome to the 15th Pfizer Colloquium of the Department of Statistics at the University of Connecticut. Since 1978, Pfizer Central Research has provided support for this colloquium series, and this has enabled us to bring to our university the most distinguished scientists in the field of statistics. It has also allowed us to videotape these colloquia for the archives of the American Statistical Association. Both the University of Connecticut and the American Statistical Association are grateful to Pfizer Central Research for this continuing support. Now, to introduce our distinguished speaker for today's colloquium, I will call upon my colleague, Dr. Ron Iman of Southwest Technology Consultants.
Today, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce one of the true icons in the statistics profession, Professor Robert Hogg from the Department of Statistics and Actuarial Science at the University of Iowa. Before he speaks, I would like to provide a little bit of background with respect to his career. Bob was born in Hannibal, Missouri, becoming the second famous author from that city. He was a prime military service age during World War II and served in the U.S. Navy from 1943 to 46. He enrolled in the University of Illinois in the fall of 1946 and completed his Bachelor's of Arts degree in mathematics in the spring of 47, having completed a lot of coursework during his time in the service. The following year, he completed an MS in actuarial science from the University of Iowa, and he received his PhD just 2 years later in 1950 from the Department of Mathematics at the University of Iowa. His thesis was completed in statistics under the direction of Alan Craig, with whom Bob established a long-time personal and professional relationship. At this time, Bob became a member of the faculty at the University of Iowa. He was a major force behind the formation of the Interdepartmental Committee of Statistics and served as its chair from 1963 to 65. As a result of his efforts, the Statistics Department was formed at the University of Iowa in 1965, with Bob as its chair and a position that he held until 1983. Bob has been very active in the activities of the American Statistical Association and served as its president in 1988. Bob organized what are widely recognized as the two most successful meetings of the ASA Winter Conference, one on statistical education in 1992 in Louisville, and a second one on TQM in 1994. Bob has been the recipient of numerous awards during his career, which include the ASA Founders Award in 1991, the prestigious Math Association of America's Award for Distinguished Teaching in 1992, and Iowa's Board of Regents Faculty Excellence Award in 1992. He is the author of numerous papers and is the co-author of 5 textbooks, the most notable of which is Hogg and Craig Introduction to Mathematical Statistics, now in its 5th edition, published by Prentice Hall. Bob plans to teach into the 1999-2000 academic year, which will complete 50 years of teaching at the University of Iowa. He always makes a very lively and memorable presentation, and we are all in for a treat as he speaks to us today about a historical perspective on statistical education in the United States.
Thank you, Ron. And in case some of you don't know who the other famous author from Hannibal was, that was Mark Twain. Just so you get this. I thought this was going to be scary. I've never quite given a talk like this, with all this setup in here, but I think it's going to work out all right. And we should have the attitude, let's have a little fun here and maybe learn a thing or two. Harry, I have to say this. I truly appreciate your efforts in this thing. When Harry contacted me last winter about doing this, I really didn't want to do it, to be truthful with you. And I said, I don't know about research like Lehman or Olkin and some of those people. I'm not in the same ballpark. And he says, well, how about statistical education? And I said, well, I do know something about statistical education. And so we agreed on that topic. And as a matter of fact, Harry came up with the title of this whole talk. Unfortunately, he didn't write the talk. That was the thing. And so we didn't. But anyhow, let's have a little fun and see how this goes. Now, I'm going to talk about statistical education in the United States, but I'm going to begin by a quote of a famous English statistician, Carl Pearson, about Florence Nightingale. Now, most of us know Florence Nightingale as a nurse, but she was also called the passionate statistician because she believed in using statistics in her arguments. I think probably originally it dealt with the care and treatment of soldiers injured in the war, but then she got off on social problems like, for instance, what deterrent, incidentally, when I do this, that means a quote. What deterrent to a criminal act are certain legal punishments, or the comparison of work programs with various forms of charity. And she even got into evaluation of the school system over there. She was really a great supporter of statistics. In a letter to Francis Galton in 1891, she argued for a chair in statistics for some teaching how to use these statistics in order to legislate for and to administer our national life with more precision and experience. Now, this is the quote of Carl Pearson about Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale believed, and in all the actions of her life acted with this belief, that the administrator could only be successful if he were guided by statistical knowledge. The legislator, to say nothing of the politician, too often failed for want of this knowledge. Nay, she went further. She held that the universe, including human communities, was evolved in accordance with a divine plan, and it was man's business to endeavor to understand such a his plan and guide his actions in sympathy with it. But to understand God's thoughts, she held that we must study statistics, for these are the measures of his purpose. Thus, the study of statistics was for her a religious duty. Now, I say amen and hallelujah, and I wish our students would study statistics like that, with some sort of conviction of that sort. The reason I really read that sort of thing is, first, to note it's important to translate data into information with statistics so certain decisions could be made, important decisions. She talked about the administrator and the legislator, but she also talked about the larger community. And today, of course, this would be the health science, engineering, business, and so on. So that's important. The second reason is, of course, I think we should improve our statistical education, not necessarily so students would study statistics as if it were their religious duty, but so they'd be at least a little more enthusiastic about it than they are nowadays. And so I will come back to those 2 points later on. But first I want to review a little bit of history. And I would like to refer to Helen Walker's book that was written in 1929. And I list there some of the early courses. Actually, the first course was taught by Professor Richard Mayo Smith at Columbia College, now university. And you'll notice I end up with those 2 decades with a note about Iowa in 1900. You might detect a little Iowa bias in this talk, but you'll have to forgive me on that sort of thing. But it turns out most of these courses were in the Department of Economics, although there were some in the social sciences, but they were about, descriptive statistics sort of as applied to the subject matter field, I would say, in those days. There were also efforts a little bit in theory, and I list some important universities there. Of course, I make a note. In mathematical statistics, the courses given by Professor James Glover at Michigan and Professor Henry Reitz at Iowa deserve special mention. This statement was probably about Michigan and Iowa about 1920s, and the reason they kind of surfaced to the top, they both had strong actuarial programs at that time. And I think so statistics was supporting the actuarial program and kind of vice versa. And I think this was very, very important. Of course, here at Connecticut, you also have an actuarial program in mathematics, and that's supportive of course, the statistics program here. There were some efforts in biology, as noted, and in educational statistics, I might mention E.L. Thorndike was, of course, at Columbia, was a leader and used many descriptive statistics in his notes on child study. And in the first chapter, he has this statement. He combats the nonsensical idea that because a certain statement about a group of facts is not true for every individual in the group, it is worthless. At least I would hope he would combat that. Next, please. By 1925, there were a number of statistics courses growing. And there was a survey by ASA, and this was over 100 schools. They of the schools, there were 84 of them that reported some courses in statistics. And it turns out at the elementary level, economics and social science kind of led the way with 86, but it was closely followed by mathematics of 57, business of 53, and education with 34. Mathematics with 40 clearly led the way in advanced courses, followed by a distant 10 for education. But Walker makes some very interesting observations in her book. And there she raises 10 questions, and I'm not going to read the 10 questions. I'm going to kind of just sort of summarize the 10. Two of them were about the location, where statistics should be taught. Should it be taught around the campus, or should it be at a central location? At that time, she was thinking about the mathematics department because there were no statistics departments. And then she raised the question, should it be required of students in the social sciences, much like a lab is required for those in the physical sciences? And then she also raised the question about, should there be an appreciation course so that students can learn this new language that was being used a lot in research? And finally, she raised a very interesting question about how to discourage consumers of statistics from being producers of statistics without further training. Now, we'll come back to that question, particularly when we talk about Harold Hotelling's article on what's called Teaching of Statistics in 1940. So we'll get back to that particular point. But there was a swing to the more mathematical aspects of statistics in the 1920s. And I've looked at this thing very carefully, and I think there probably are three leaders in this movement, and one of them is Henry Reitz of Iowa, other Harry Carver of Michigan, and then Harold Hotelling of Columbia. And I'd like to say a few words about each one of these persons. In my opinion, Henry Reitz, again, Iowa bias here, guys, should be considered the dean of American mathematical statisticians. He wrote a lot in statistics and actuarial science, I might add. And I might call your attention to his delightful 1927 Karras monograph entitled Mathematical Statistics. He had a lot of PhD students, and I'm going to list a few of them that were really influential. Frank Wida and Herb Meyer, Sam Wilkes, Alan Craig, Selby Robinson, Carl Fisher, Frank Satterthwaite. Maybe some of you recognize some of those names. But these were a few of his PhD students. But maybe most importantly, I think Henry Reitz had more to do with the founding of the Institute of Mathematical Statistics than anybody else. He was really the major player. He had help from Carver and others, but he was the guy that did it. And the Institute was formed in 1935. Reitz became the first president of the Institute and actually served as president through 1936. And so he was really a leader, and of course, IMS has the Reitz Lecture to honor him every other year at their annual meeting. Harry Carver joined the faculty at Michigan in 1916, and he was really the dominant figure in statistics up there for a long, long time. Actually, he had a warm and sympathetic manner and had 10 PhD students himself. He was a pretty good athlete, and he was a little eccentric, however, from what I hear, and I've heard stories about Carver quite a bit. He often dined on crackers and milk, and then he would challenge students in his class at games of like pool and billiards and running, putting the shot. Alan Craig used to tell this story. We used to have these old hand crank calculators, and it wasn't how fast you could calculate, but how many times you could turn the crank in a minute. And of course, they always say the story was Carver never lost. Now, I don't know whether that was true or not, but he was obviously pretty good in this thing. Now, his major contribution, of course, is the founding of the Annals of Mathematical Statistics. And you might be interested in a little bit about the research opportunities at that time. Through the 20s, there was not really a lot of good outlets for mathematical statistics. As a matter of fact, I think the mathematicians sort of looked down on the statisticians. Maybe they still do. They were a little suspicious of them, and I say maybe they still are, particularly if our research involved any real data. And so on the other hand, the American Statistical Association, the math stat people were just too theoretical for them. If you go back and look at ASA at that time, JASA is nothing, it was nothing back then like it is today. And so you had this problem. So Carver thought there should be a better outlet, and he started, essentially at his own expense, the Annals in 1930. Now, in all fairness to ASA, they did give a little support there initially, but you got to remember the times. It was the Depression, and even that was withdrawn in 1933. When the Institute was formed, Carver looked upon IMS as a possible home for his annals. And he and Reitz had quite a bit of correspondence. And in one letter to Reitz, he writes, "I want most of all to have the annals to be a regular official organ of the Institute, but do not want to see the Institute assume that burden until a number of years have passed and they are on a firm financial basis." Again, in all fairness at ASA, there were some people, and particularly Fred Stefan, that wanted the Institute to be sort of a section of ASA, and he tried very hard to get the Institute to be that part. But Carver was afraid. He was afraid of what would happen to his annals in case it went over to ASA. And in another letter to Reitz, he writes, "I realize that the future board of directors of the association may undo with a single stroke all that we have accomplished, since the majority of the membership of the association are not mathematically, statistically minded." And so Carver in 1938 turned the annals over to IMS. And actually the first editorial board, Sam Wilkes was the editor, and two associate editors, Jersey Naiman and Alan Craig. I'll tell you, Wilkes was an outstanding choice for this. He served in that capacity for 12 years. And I would say he made the Annals the most influential statistics journal of that time. Now, I'm not talking about the Annals today. I'm talking about if you look at the Annals back in the late 40s and compare it to other journals, I say it was the most influential statistics journal. And so we really owe Wilkes a vote of thanks. And of course, he made a number of contributions to the theory of statistics. After the Institute was formed and the Annals was settled as a home, they found a home in the Institute. There was some stability at that time, and then a major problem then was the teaching of statistics in colleges and universities. And I think some of the members of the Institute sort of tackled this. And that really brings us to Harold Hotelling. Now, Hotelling was really a giant. And I use that word, a giant, among economists and statisticians in the late 20s and early 30s. And of course, he continued to contribute after that time. If you look at his generalization of students' T, the T squared, 1931, that's a brilliant paper. Thinking of the time of that. 2 years later, he did one on principal components, again in the Annals. That was in 1933. But as outstanding as some of Hotelling's contributions were to the theory, really it's his 1940 article, The Teaching of Statistics, that we really want to explore today. In that article, by the way, he gave the talk to IMS too, but in that he talks about if another department wants to give a statistics course, they usually pick on the young faculty member to do it. He refers them to as Young Jones. And so Young Jones teaches the course teaches it again, teaches it again. Oh, after 4 or 5, 6 times, he's an expert. And so he's going to write a book, a non-mathematical book for his colleagues and students so they can understand statistics. And of course, this goes on and on again, and there are a lot of young Joneses created, and frequently, many of them write their own book. Hotelling points out that this contributes nothing to the development of statistics, and often errors are introduced that are copied time and time again. And so from his whole analysis of the situation, Hotelling proposes the establishment of properly staffed departments of statistics. Now, this was in 1940, and the Institute of Mathematical Statistics adopted this and gave it wide circulation. I would say, of course, we have lots of departments of statistics nowadays. Most major research universities have such a department. I look at the Big Ten, and Indiana is the only one that does not. Shame on you, Indiana, I say. By the way, maybe if they want a department of statistics, maybe they could use a clip out of this to try to get one, but anyhow. But, you know, now this whole thing might have happened without Hotelling. You never know. But actually, he was the leader of this thing, and he's the one that got it started. I had some correspondence with Jack Hall. Oh, this was 12 or 15 years ago. At the time, Hotelling wrote that article. He was at Columbia. And then he went to North Carolina in 1946 to head the department down there. And Jack Hall was one of the students and later became a faculty member at North Carolina. And he had this to say about Hotelling. Hotelling, the leader in the revolutionary idea that statisticians should teach most of the statistics around campus, founded the most conservative department of them all when it came to carrying out this idea. The faculty rejoiced in the luxury of teaching only graduate students. But it always struck me as ridiculous, and in parentheses he says, and irresponsible too, that this should occur in Hotelling's department. And of course, most of us that know the North Carolina program know that's absolutely true. Now, despite those remarks of Hall's, I think we have to agree that Hotelling, along with Reitz and Carver, really started a lot of the development of statistics and statistical education in the late 20s and through the 30s. And then actually we sort of have an explosion in some of the statistics. I have the next. I realized the importance of departments and the importance of people in some of these departments, and I went back and tried to trace find the first department with statistics in its title. And the one I came up with is the one at Johns Hopkins, Biometry and Vital Statistics, and in the School of Public Health there. I list 2 dates, one 1916 and one 1918. I'm not too sure which one is right. I think it was founded in 1916, but they didn't have as faculty nor students until 1918. And then they got going. And incidentally, they had some pretty good statisticians there, Raymond Pearl and Lowell Reed, Bill Cochran, and Jerry Cornfield chaired some of that department in some of the early days. Now, that department is not in a college of arts or a college in science where most of us reside today, and neither is the one that was established at the Wharton School in 1931 called Economics and Social Statistics. Incidentally, they dropped those modifiers, I believe, in the 50s, and it just became the Department of Statistics there. But that wasn't in arts and science. The first one I could find in arts and science was actually at George Washington University in 1935, and that was headed by Frank Wyda. Now, by the way, Frank was one of Reitz's students, and he was joined by one of his students, Solomon Kuhlback, and later I mentioned that Boyd Harshbarger was one of the early PhDs, I think in 1940 there. Next. Other departments followed, but frequently there was a stat lab first. For instance, I go to my sister university in Iowa, a great department at Iowa State, but they had their stat lab in 1933 and later the department in 1947. George Snedeker was the guy that got things going over there. He was there in the teens. In 1923 and 24, he got Henry Wallace. Now, Henry Wallace, that was a time, Henry Wallace was Wallace's farmer at that time, and of course later he was the Vice President of the United States. But he gave several lectures in that academic year on the application of statistics to ag. And so this was an important connection. And of course later on, Snedeker wrote his statistical methods. And I would say that and all of its revisions probably is the most cited, well, not, I shouldn't say the most, but certainly among the most cited publications in the Science Citation Index. I think the Rothamsted connection played a big role in Ames' development too. R.A. Fisher paid 2 visits to Ames in the 30s. Frank Yates visited there for an entire year. Bill Cochran was a member of the department. Oscar Kempthorne came after Bill left. I might mention Herman O. Hartley on that, the famous Hoe. H.A. David tells the story of Hoe. Hoe was of dual nationality, German and English. And it turns out some of his early papers were published under H.O. Hirschfeld. And Hartley turns out to be a clever translation of Hirschfeld. The Hirsch going to Hart, and the Feld to Field to Lee. And so we get Hartley. And of course Hartley came to Iowa State in 54, left in 63, to go to Texas A&M to head the Institute of Statistics there. I have to mention one graduate from Iowa State, 1931, Gertrude Cox, because Gertrude Cox plays a very, very important role in the development of statistics. And as a matter of fact, the North Carolina president at that time wanted to do something like they had at Ames, and so he conferred with Snedeker how to do it. And Snedeker recommended 5 young men. And then he added kind of half-heartedly, if you would consider a woman, I know of no one better qualified than Gertrude Cox. And sure enough, North Carolina State hired Gertrude Cox, and she was marvelous. She started the Department of Experimental Statistics in 1941 at Raleigh, the Institute of Statistics in 44, and then the Mathematical Statistics Department, that was at Chapel Hill in 46, and that's the one Hotelling went down there to head, and then Biostatistics in 1941 again at Chapel Hill. Also the Statistical Research Division at the Research Triangle, that was in 1959. I would say actually the Research Triangle has played a big role in the economic development of North Carolina, and I don't know why more places don't do that sort of thing. I'm going to go to Boyd Harshbarger again. After his PhD from George Washington, he went to VPI. It's still Virginia Polytechnic Institute to me. They call it, hey, the football team's got it's called Virginia Tech most of the time. It's still VPI to me. But he had a joint arrangement with mathematics and ag there, and he started a stat lab in the early 40s. 1949, they started a department in the College of Arts and Science there, and the stat lab continued in the ag experiment station. But very importantly, with Gertrude Cox, he started the Committee on Statistics of the Southern Regional Educational Board. This was a very important development, and out of that they started, and I can remember when they started these things, the graduate summer schools, the first one being at VPI in 1954. That continued for a long time. Right now, that committee runs the Summer Research Conference. Actually, that's co-sponsored by ASA, by the way. The next one, let's flip to the other coast. Jersey Neyman, outstanding. And he started the stat lab at Berkeley in 1938 and had a number of great students there and, of course, great faculty. Of course, Eric Lehman and Joe Hodges were 2 of the early ones, and they joined the faculty later. Jersey enjoyed life as well as statistics. We had Jersey out at Iowa for a week, and he ran us ragged. I'll tell you. But I always remember his favorite toast. to all the ladies present and to some of those absent. We really owe Jersey a great vote of thanks, I think. He was wonderful. Let's go to the sister school, Stanford there. Of course, it's a private school. Al Bowker headed it up, and M.A. Gershik was there, and he had a large number of good appointments. In 1951, they went to Sequoia Hall. A lot of us know Sequoia Hall. It's famous in this, and I understand that they've just torn that down, and they now are in a new building, which they have named Sequoia Hall. So they're still in Sequoia Hall. I might point out that Charles Stein shows up on both the Berkeley list and the Stanford list. Now, how did that happen? Well, now, some of you are very young, and you don't remember Joe McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin. He called lots of people communists. By the way, he was later put down for doing this, but nevertheless, this McCarthyism spread around, and some states required their faculty to sign loyalty oaths, and California was one of them. And Stein, not that he was disloyal to the United States, wouldn't sign. He didn't think it was appropriate for a faculty member to need to sign a loyalty oath. And so he didn't sign. And so he had to leave Berkeley, and of course, Stanford picked him up. I noticed some of my buddies bound down there at Stanford. Of course, Herman Chernoff and Manny Parson. A lot of great gang. You know, I would say Al Bowker was kind of a visionary in his appointments. They're going to, at this elite private school, they're going to have a rather small department. And Bowker figured out, if I make some carefully selected joint appointments, I can almost double my faculty. And he did. And there are a lot of people, even to this day, that have joint appointments. Chicago had a committee on statistics, 1949, excuse me. By the way, the word committee bugged some of those old members of the department. It was really a department of statistics. And they had to, when they were trying to recruit students, they had to explain, why do we have this word committee on there? But they had a great gang of people. It later became, of course, a department in 1956. Jimmy Savage was the first chair. By the way, that's Jimmy, that's J-I-M-M-I-E. That was his middle name. His first name was Leonard, but he always went by Jimmy Savage. And of course, he was one of the leaders of the Neo-Bayesians. I might mention. Speaking of Bayesians, I'm going to mention Minnesota next. By the way, some of these departments are in no special order. I try to use kind of 1960 as a cutoff. I can't mention all departments of statistics, but I'm trying to mention some of the early leaders in this. Of course, they started a department, Minnesota, in 1957, and Richard Savage, Jimmy's brother, I believe was the first chair there. Of course, Milton Sobel was an early faculty member. They started the School of Statistics much later, 1970. By the way, the first and only director of the school, I remember it started in 1970, Seymour Geiser. That's a long time, Seymour. Maybe he's going to live forever. Well, but he's to be congratulated. He's done a good job. Michigan State, I started in 55, and again, a list of good people there. Herman Rubin showed up in Stanford, and of course, Herman's one of those guys that move around sometimes, and of course, he later went to Purdue. I don't know whether Purdue satisfies my 1960 cutoff, but as long as I mention Purdue, I have to mention Shani Gupta, who chaired the department for a long, long time down there. Next, please. Ralph Bradley was a faculty member at VPI, and he went to Florida State in the late 50s to start a department there. He picked up Wilcoxon on a part-time basis, and actually I think Wilcoxon was a great inspiration to some of the young faculty members and graduate students there. I look at Ralph Bradley, and one of his strengths was he was able to go out and get good funding, NSF and NIH funding, and then he went out and recruited very good graduate students, some of whom are leaders of today. I'm going to have a conversation with Ron Randalls later on, and he was one of them. You see, I gave you a plug, Ron, so you get that. And so you get that. But I had a little conversation with Paul Minton later. Paul used to be at SMU, and Paul said, when I was recruiting for SMU, I'd go out, and I'd found out 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before I got around to trying to recruit, darn it, Ralph Bradley had been there. And then I told this to Ralph, what Paul had said. And he said, well, maybe that was true. But he says, I learned how to beat the bushes from Boyd Harshbarger and Gertrude Cox. Maybe we ought to learn that today, how to go out and recruit graduate students. But they did well. Holly Fryer, I got a Kansas State guy over here. And I got to mention Kansas State. Started the stat lab in 46. He was, by the way, he was Snedeker's first PhD student. And hey, also another Kansas State guy. I got 2 of them. I'm surrounded today. But Holly tried very hard to get the Department of Statistics going through the 50s, and the president kept turning him back. And the only reason I tell this because he finally got the department in the late 50s. And the reason being, Holly got an offer from an outside group. And the president wanted to keep Fryer, and so he gave him his department. But I say that happened lots of places, I'm sure. Wisconsin, I mentioned George Box was going to leave Princeton in '59, gave a talk at Wisconsin. And in the talk, he suggested how to form a Department of Statistics. And the comment after was, great, would you like to come here and do it? And he did. Great department. I can remember going up there and visiting in the 60s. And they were above a drugstore at that time. I think it was a drugstore down there. But they were on the second deck of this building. And they had their office. Great esprit de corps. It was really wonderful. I could always remember, and I think maybe that was the first time I ever met George Chow, and I had a lively discussion with him. Every time I meet George Chow, I have a lively discussion with him. But the 2 Georges, Box and Chow, are 2 of my favorite characters, and I emphasize characters. Great guys, great guys. There was early, by the way, I'm going to list all these. There were some early consulting services, Oregon State, Lyle Calvin, the Stat Lab at Ohio State, Ransom Whitney. Actually, the Ohio State department started much later, and that was true with Oklahoma State. Carl Marshall provided services there. I have to mention Rutgers department, and the reason, the old OT department, which was very applied department. But some of my buddies like Ron Snee and Brian Joyner swear by the old OT program. They think it's great, and so I have to mention the OT program. The next one, by the way, these are the collegiate peaks. Now, why are those first 4 the collegiate peaks? Actually, about a year and a half ago, I bought a piece of property out in Colorado. And it's in a beautiful valley surrounded by these 14,000-foot mountains. And it's a little town, they pronounce it Buena Vista out there. I know that's not the Spanish pronunciation, but that's what they're cowboys out there, you got to remember. And at Buena Vista, and it turns out the 4 mountains right around Buena Vista and around this property are the collegiate peaks, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. We got a great view of Princeton. If I ever build out there and retire and sit back, I'll think of all these statisticians. I look at those collegiate peaks. I gave this talk at Iowa about a week and a half ago, and I found out I was reading too much, so I'm not reading as much to you guys here today. It was better, it was more Bob Hogg if I just sort of kind of talked to you and rambled on. But my colleague Tim Robertson came up and he says, you mentioned Jack Wolfowitz, but you didn't mention Jack Kiefer. And I said, but Cornell didn't have a department, and that's true, but they had some good statisticians, Bob Beckhofer and Walt Federer, in addition to Jack Kiefer. Jack Kiefer was really a wonderful guy. I remember when we had him out at the Craig Lectures. Oh, gosh. That must have been roughly 24 years ago, 23, 24 years ago. And Jack and I, these are in the spring of the year, Jack and I started, for some reason or other, started comparing birthdays. And he had just had his 50th birthday at that time. And I said, oh, my birthday's in November, and I'll be 50 years old. And he said, oh. And I said, we're essentially the same age. And Jack says, oh, no. You're in your 40s. You're in your 40s, and I'm in my 6th decade. So he made it. Jack was really a super guy. I have to say that. Next, I know I've missed a lot of people, but I've tried to mention some. here, just not enough time. I have to mention some things that happened during World War II. I kept hearing about particularly the Columbia Research Group. But there was also a Princeton Research Group, and they had a branch that was called the Fire Control Research. And the reason I mention that, John Tukey was in that branch, and that was where he was weaned from topology. He was a topologist to statistics. Also I noticed Charlie Windsor was that group, and maybe that's where Tukey coined the word Windsorizing, and some of us robustniks know about. But anyhow, we got that. The Columbia group was a wonderful group under Alan Wallace. Gee, I have a lot of names here: Gersig, Savage, Bowker, Paulson, Jack Wolfowitz, or Abraham Wall. Man, you put a lot of people like that together and something's going to happen, I know. There was another branch of Princeton in New York, and actually in the same building the Wallace group was in. And it turned out Fred Mosteller was assigned to that group. And Fred was transferred to the Columbia group. They worked back and forth. They were in the same building. And when they wrote the book Sampling Inspection, actually Harold Freeman, Milton Friedman, Fred Mosteller, and Alan Wallace were the authors. Another book out of that group, Selected Techniques of Statistical Analysis, and then there was the famous Sequential Analysis by Abraham Wall. This was a great book. Alan Craig taught a summer course in 1948 on sequential analysis. I'd only had 6 hours of statistics before this. This was a 2-hour course. That's all the statistics I had. But I thought, boy, this is great stuff. And of course, later on, Wall wrote Statistical Decision Functions about 1950, if I remember right. And that was a very influential book. The other thing in World War II were the short courses in statistical quality control. I list some of the main people: Deming, Olds, Burr, Westcott, and Noller. These were a few of the people that participated in these short courses. I might say Ed Deming. You got to understand, after the war, Americans wanted things. They gave up things during World War II. They wanted things, and so manufacturers forgot about quality control, really. And at that time, Deming had gone over to Japan and taught them how to use statistical methods. And in doing so, and of course, a philosophy of management. And then the Americans wouldn't pay any attention to Deming. Deming was always mad at the Americans. And Deming was right. And of course, finally, the Americans woke up in the 1970s, or actually around 1980, and they started paying attention again to Deming and some of the quality gurus. But those were important developments. I look for books, and I've mentioned a couple of books, one by Reitz and Snedeker, and some of these. The Wall books were very important, of course. I look for books before World War II. I find Paul Ryder, probably well to mention Paul Ryder's name. John Kenny had one. I don't think these had great influence on statistical education. And really, it was after the war, Harold Kramer, wrote an outstanding and advanced book, Mathematical Methods of Statistics. It had a great influence. I know it did on me. Of course, I was a graduate student at that time, and I pored over Kramer. You ought to see my copy of Kramer. It's all marked up and beat up. It's a wonderful book. Now, you students out there, you study Hogan Craig like that. I'll mention that in a minute. Actually, Paul Hull had a book, Introduction to Mathematical Statistics, and it was right around 1950. Alex Mood wrote his Introduction to Theory of Statistics. That was a very good book. I taught Hull and Mood, and actually a good probability book by Feller. Feller was outstanding. I really enjoyed that through the 50s. Later on, I taught one by Manny Parson. But I like to think that Alan Craig's and my effort in the late 50s, we published the first edition in 1959, Mathematical Statistics, had some influence. I find today that a lot of statisticians were sort of weaned from mathematics to statistics, or they say, we learned my statistics from Hogan Craig. I like to think we had some influence. By the way, of course, I'm putting in a personal plug here, now you ought to understand. We were really innovative there in those early years. We got, in that first edition, we got sufficient statistics in before page 100. Now I'm going to confess to you, the beginning graduate students in statistics at Iowa now use a book by Casella and Berger. I say that because I figure that would be worth a kickback from George and Roger. So we'll just see how it goes on. Now, after this was all kind of right around 1960, and after that, of course, lots of books, lots of departments. I have to mention one man at this point. How's my time doing? How am I doing? Oh, Yingo! That's a Iowa saying. In other words, move on. But I got to mention Fred Mosteller here. I used to get my daughter Mary up early, my oldest daughter up, and this was around late 50s or early 60s, and plunk her down in her chair in the breakfast room, and give her a bowl of cereal to shut her up, and turn on the TV, and there was this guy teaching elementary statistics on the Continental Classroom, and that was Fred Mosteller. Did a great job. Actually, Fred did maybe more importantly, it was a talk he gave to the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. This was in the late 60s, and from that we had two results. They formed the ASA NCTM committee, and then SAG2, Statistics, A Guide to the Unknown, was written. And SAG2 is a great effort, I think. Of course, it's a lot of essays written by outstanding statisticians, and it can be used, I think, to even supplement the elementary courses today. I better quickly get over this thing. By the way, I got to mention that Gottfried Noether served on this committee with me during the 70s. I had the opportunity to chair that committee, 77 to 80. There was a Canadian, Jim Swift, that followed me. He was on the NCTM side. And he had a great imagination. He had all ways of teaching this statistics to elementary, well, not only elementary, middle schools, high school kids. He was wonderful. He used all sorts of variation of Tukey's exploratory data analysis. Dick Schaefer came along then, and Dick was a great addition. Jim Swift chaired it after me, then Dick chaired it, and in my opinion, maybe other than Fred Mosteller, I think Dick Schaefer has had more influence on statistical education in K through 12 than any other person. He got 4 NSF grants. This allowed him to prepare materials. It allowed him to give workshops for teachers. He had a lot of help. It sort of all flies under the name of the QL program, quantitative literacy, EQL for elementary stuff, and then later on more advanced stuff, data-driven mathematics. But Dick did a great job. I have to quickly mention the statistical education section of ASA, very inactive back in the 60s. I had the opportunity to chair it in the early 70s, 73, I believe. And to show you how inactive it was, I think at our business meeting we had 5 people were there. Now, I didn't do anything for the section, except I think I appointed you, Harry, to some committee. That's the second thing I did. The one thing I did, it was called the section on training at that time. I thought training was a terrible word, and I proposed at that meeting, we changed it to statistical education. All 5 of us voted that, and I reported to the ASA office. Wasn't that easy. I had lots of hoops to go through, one of which was to rewrite the Constitution. I did, and at the end of the whole thing, we had a new name anyhow. I chaired the section again about 10 years later, and of course all the activity going on, I couldn't believe it. One of the most pleasing things to me is the liberal arts group, what they call the isolated statistician, because each of them is usually the only statistician at his or her college, and so they're isolated statisticians. This group got going, early to mid-'80s. Actually, David Moore, and I'm glad I mentioned David Moore, our president of ASA, was the advisor, and David has been great for statistical education. And of course, he did the video Against All Odds. He was the advisor for that. It was wonderful. Dick Schaefer was also the chair of a committee that made recommendations to the college board that we start AP exams, advanced placement exams in statistics. And this was a great development. I think, we just gave the AP exams, well, a year and a half ago the first time, and over 7,000 students took it. This year, over 16,000 students took it. Those are huge numbers that they have. And so this is great. Where do we stand, son? Okay. I'm on a roll, way behind. I'm going to retire, as Ron mentioned, in 2000, I think. I joined the faculty in 50, and if I go through 99, 2000, that gives me a neat 50 years. It's been wonderful. I'm not trying to make a record, but I've really loved it. I think it gives me some right to talk a little bit about the future. Why don't you give a next thing? I kind of reviewed what's going on, and I'll quickly go over these things. It was amazing initially, some of the books before World War II, how the stress on moments. And how many of you know what a probable error is? By the way, it's you do it, Harry? 0.6745 of a standard deviation. Now your assignment is why is it called that? But they did the Pearson class of frequency function and so on like that. After the war, you're more on maximum likelihood, Neyman-Pearson kind of things. And then as we got towards the end of the 50s, good sampling distribution theory, sufficient statistics, Bayes came into play. I found out that if I looked at elementary statistics courses, after the war, they were sort of baby math stat. They started off probability and some distributions. They kind of took Holt's format, and I think this is the wrong thing to do. But I see strong efforts in liberal arts, statistical education for engineer and business. The business gang got a great group doing it. And by the way, John McKenzie's sitting back there. He's one of them that works with that. And I think we're doing the right thing, and I think it's closer to what we should be doing in this sort of thing. In the graduate education, we've got the best in the world. By the way, one time we were way behind the English and the Indians, but we're the best in the world now. And students come to our country to study statistics. We teach the Fisher concepts well, the Neyman-Pearson-Wall stuff. The Bayesian methods are becoming more popular, particularly as we get good computational facilities, the Gibbs samplers, and so on. But there's concern, in my mind, that others are, well, taking some of our action. Not that we ought to have all of the action, but I think they're taking some of the action away from us, and I won't read all the topics that I think that they're doing. And I would simply say this, and the dean even mentioned it in his introduction, that we should be more concerned about interdisciplinary programs. I think we should have more flexibility in our graduate program and let our graduate students, some of them, not all of them, participate in some of the projects in outside fields. I think that's very important. I also think we have to strengthen our undergraduate program. I wouldn't have said this 25 years ago, but I believe that we must do that. We've got to strengthen that undergraduate program, and I think AP will help, but I think the American Statistical Association should take a lead in this sort of thing and have a workshop, a wide open workshop involving, well, some people from industry, but certainly people from the departments of statistics, maybe some of the isolated statisticians. And I think we should have this wide, and we should talk about even certification we should bring up. That I hate to sound like Stu Hunter did when he was the president, but we've got to strengthen this. Incidentally, we do have some good undergraduate programs. I mentioned Brigham Young, and we could certainly kind of benchmark on there. The other thing that I would like to just quickly mention, the other challenge that I should mention, is a lot of statistics is taught by non-statisticians. We aren't going to get away from that. The mathematicians, the sociologists, the psychologists, the engineering, we can't do this. We have to cooperate with them. We've got to help them. By the way, we want to train more statisticians, but we have to help them teach students about statistical thinking. And I think we have to do that. And so I would say these are the three major challenges. Some flexibility in our graduate program to reach out to, I think we should improve statistical education for our undergraduate, attract more people, and I think we have to help the non-statisticians teach statistical thinking to our students. I think I better conclude now, or else they're going to cut my neck off if I understand the rules of this game, but it's been nice talking to you. I hope you learned something. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for a fascinating and exciting talk. It was typically Bob Hogg. I think you know an awful lot of people. This concludes the 15th Pfizer Colloquium.